Hello and good evening, Police Science Doctor Tribe. This is Susanne Knabe-Nicol from policesciencedoctor.com, the website where we turn academic findings and research in the fields of intelligence, law enforcement, policing, military, anything else that's related to that, into things that can actually be used by practitioners. And as part of that mission, sometimes what I do is I interview somebody who's an expert in their respective field. And today is such an evening where I'm interviewing Chris Allen. Now, let me just read something about Chris Allen. He's a researcher, lecturer, consultant, and commentator specializing in organized crime and how it operates. He has significant experience in lecturing on UK and international policing structures, as well as drug trafficking, cybercrime, human trafficking, and firearms trafficking, amongst other subjects. He is currently honorary research fellow at the University of Buckingham and an associate lecturer at the London Metropolitan Art and Universities. Concurrently, Chris is currently director of Crimin's Training and Consultancy Services, which provides a range of solutions to law enforcement, universities, and the private sector. As part of Criminus, he has been commissioned to write regular pieces on the latest organized crime trends for Policing Insight, recently publishing pieces on the financial impact of wildlife trafficking in West Africa and the drugs trade. So let me just see. It seems I'm having troubles streaming to LinkedIn. That's obviously not good. Okay, I don't know if we're streaming to LinkedIn, but I hope we are. And Chris, welcome to the program. How are you?
Thank you, Suzanne. Yeah, very well. Delighted to be here.
Okay, so I read a bit about your bio, but why don't we start by you telling us yourself, who you are and why people might know you, because that might be different from your bio.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, my name is Chris Allen. I'm a researcher, lecturer, commentator, consultant, specialising in organised crime. So there's several reasons why I sort of might have popped up, because I've got quite a few different hats in terms of different roles that I play. So I lecture, as I mentioned there, at University of Buckingham, where I run the MA in transnational organised crime, which is a course alongside Professor Julian Richards, which I designed and focuses specifically on some of the elements of transnational organised crime. I'm also an associate lecturer at London Met, so I'm currently teaching organised crime there, so just finishing off a module to their Masters Criminal Justice students, which has been a really fascinating experience actually. And I also work for Liverpool John Moores University as a sessional lecturer and Arden University as well. In terms of the research, I've recently completed a piece of research for John Moores University funded by the Home Office, which was looking at financial investigators and looking at some of the structures behind the policing of financial crime, and that was a really interesting project. I've also popped up doing research for City of London Police and the Home Office, and what I also do is I lead the organised crime coverage for a website called Policing Insight. So it's essentially looking at giving opinion pieces on the latest trends on organised crime. So looking at some of the big reports from people like Interpol, Europol, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime. I tend to write a couple of comment pieces a month on various trends in organised crime, which is, again, something I really enjoy because it gives me that freedom, rather than an academic journal, to sit there and try and actually examine some of these issues and actually posit some of the solutions as well. So yeah, I've got quite a few different hats, as you might have seen me floating around. Organised crime is quite a niche world, so you may well have seen me floating around.
Well, the good thing about working in a niche is that you'll become one of the few go-to experts on the field. And like you said, you publish for Policing Insight. Policing Insight is something that we in the in the industry know very well. They have published some of my articles as well. And you've interviewed me for Policing Insight a few months ago, haven't you? And that came out as well. So I'm just going to show you. So you guys, so this is Criminus. This is your own website. Just briefly tell us what you've got on there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did. Criminus is essentially the side of things that I do in terms of training courses and consultancy. So one of the projects we had over lockdown was working with the Ivory Coast. So that was a really interesting project because it was I met someone at a conference a couple of years back who was the head of strategy for the Ivory Coast, for the president of the Ivory Coast, and we designed a training course for focusing on organised crime and also intelligence that we were going to deliver to the police in the Ivory Coast. Unfortunately, a little thing called COVID had something to do, had a little thing to do with it through a nice spanner in the works with that one. But in terms, that was sort of some of the stuff I do through Criminus. I also do then, training courses like the ones we're talking about today on terms of drug trafficking, human trafficking, cybercrime, and also on the U-Battle Toolkit, which is my an investigative strategy development tool, which looks at how organised crime operates as a business and how we can use business analysis to enhance investigations.
Yeah. Okay. So whilst this is a live interview, obviously we've got an audience watching. We've got people on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn watching. If you've got any questions, guys, then if you want to ask Chris a question, please just type it into the comments. So there's the chat function wherever you're watching this, but start it with a Q, because if it's a comment, then the comment might be for your fellow watchers, and you guys might have some conversations and comments yourself. But if there's something that you would like to put me to Chris, and you would like me to put to Chris, then please start it with a Q, and then I'll know, and I'll be showing that to him. So today we're talking about organized crime, and I know you're doing your PhD. You've got your Viva lined up in January, so hopefully that will all go well. We'll keep our fingers crossed. But how did you become interested in organized crime? What led you to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting. I came at it from a completely different perspective, actually, because my undergraduate degree is in journalism. So I studied journalism at Staffordshire University from 2011 to 2013. So, and that I did got 2-1 in that. And during the training as a journalist, I'm a mad keen football fan. I wanted to write about football at the time. Organised crime and policing wasn't even on the agenda. So I spent most of my time at Stoke Uni following Stoke under-18s about to Newcastle and Sunderland and lots of cold places on wintry Wednesday nights. And then afterwards, I'm from Oxfordshire, and the first job I got in journalism was for Police Professional, which is a similar publication to Policing Insight. They were a printed magazine. And so I started covering policing for them. So I was reading sort of some of these reports from the National Crime Agency, from Europol, from various, writing and interviewing senior police officers on a daily basis. And it sort of got me thinking. I was like, some of this stuff is really fascinating about sort of the causes of the crime behind it, and some of the tactics that the police are using. And I wanted to sit there, and I remember having a conversation with my boss, and I was like, well, this is an 80-page report on, I think it was vehicle crime, but I want to do a really in-depth feature on it. And it was like, no, you can't, because you've got 3 other stories to write this afternoon. But you can't just sit and delve into this report. And it was then I realised I wanted to do it in a bit more depth. So I then saved a bit and did my master's degree full-time for a year at Coventry University, and that was in terrorism, international crime, and global security. Once I came out of that, I then started working for the Police Foundation, which is a UK's policing think tank, that was fascinating. I did some stuff on cybercrime with them, some stuff on neighbourhood policing, and following that I then joined City of London Police as a researcher and analyst. And then from there I got City of London to fund me a place at the Serious Organised Crime Conference, which I then met Dan Silverstone, who's a director at Liverpool John Moores University Centre for Policing Studies. I mentioned by that point I was sort of thinking about doing a PhD, I had an idea of what I wanted to write about, I just didn't want to pay for it. He suddenly said, actually, we've got a scholarship coming up, you should apply for it. I then did that, and then from there I then transitioned fully into academia, lecturing, researching, and left policing and latterly journalism behind.
And so that's a bit of a varied story there, from football to journalism, and actually wanting to read an 80-page report. I think that's probably what sticks out at me the most. So that's a true analyst there for you. Definitely not something that I would be incredibly excited about, but I'm glad that you are, because somebody's got to do it, and somebody's got to understand these reports and then translate them into something more pleasant for us, or something less unpleasant. Anyway.
Yeah, that's a key thing of what I do for Policing Insight, trying to summarize a 100-page report into a 1,000-word article. And I think was one of the reasons why I enjoy this role now, because I love to read. I've got shelves you can't quite see it here, but in the office there's just books of organised, especially during the pandemic when there's nothing else to spend money on. I just buy organised crime books off Amazon and just sit and read them. So have that ability.
I'm glad that people like you exist, Chris. I'm glad that people like you exist. We need them. How does organized crime differ from other types of crime that police and law enforcement deal with?
I think the best comparison really is, so if you take something like murder, so homicide, there's a manual which is for some reason, somebody has managed to leak it online. There's a if you go to Google now, there's the 2006 homicide. So the murder manual for police officers, and it details
from the NPIA.
From the NPIA, which
I've got a
details
copy.
precisely how police investigate crime. I mean, if you want to reverse engineer that from a criminal perspective, then I'm not sure it should still be on the internet. But the point being that there is a manual for murder. There is, whether you've been shot in the head, whether you've been drowned, whether you've been thrown in a vat of acid, or there are certain steps in the murder process that have to be followed each time. And yeah, so you have to gather your evidence, you have to look at DNA, etc. But with organised crime, because it's such a multitude of crimes, it includes so many different sort of elements. So you've got drug trafficking, money laundering, you've got corruption, cyber crime. There's so many different crimes that constituent, so that can make up organised crime. Therefore, there isn't a manual or a specific way of investigating it. And I think that's the key thing with organised crime. It's not, while we have a subject we call organised crime, there is no one definition of it. There is no one sort of element to it, which makes it challenging to study, but also really fascinating to study as well.
I mean, you just said there's no definition of it. Can you give us a definition or your best definition of it? So, just for people who are maybe working in completely different fields, just they get an idea of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, well, there's actually about 20 definitions of it, which is
good.
Great. So the UN have got a definition, the NCA have got a definition, Interpol have got one. Generally, it's more the sort of standard sort of converged definition, more than 3 people working together in the pursuit of serious and in pursuit of activities that would generally constitute a sort of more than a 3-year prison sentence. Generally, they've got to have that. They've got to be working together, and they've got to be doing it on a regular basis, and there's got to be more than 3 of them, and it's got to be a reasonably serious activity.
Yeah, there's so the definition that I read, it also said, they have to be collaborating over time, and that's what I said to my students when I was actually teaching a lesson on organized crime. Use some of your material, by the way. Thank you very much. And I told them it has to be over time. It's not like Ocean's 11, who come together for one project and then disband again. It has to be something more permanent than that.
But then if you took that from Ocean's 13, when they've been together for 3 projects, you could then argue they become an organised crime group.
Very true. Very true. Yeah, I don't remember now if they lost
fantastic set of films, actually.
What are some of the common mistakes or missed opportunities by law enforcement when it comes to organized crime groups or organized crime investigations?
I think the big one is treating it like it's one crime type. So again, we go back to the sort of murder point. So if you've got an organized crime group that you're investigating, and they're dealing drugs, but as well as that, they've got a protection racket, and generally if they're dealing in drugs and they've got a protection racket, they're making lots of illicit cash on the side, and therefore there has to be they've got to have some mechanism of taking that cash, laundering it into the legitimate system, and getting out the other end again. So there's got to be different strands of this investigation because there's so many different elements to the OCG. You can't just have there's no one size fits all for organised crime, because it isn't one crime. And that's, I think, the key bit to understand. The reason why there isn't an organised crime investigation manual is because you can't have the same template for a template that works for an organised crime group based in Italy that's selling fake leather jackets that end up on a market in London is completely different to an organised crime group that's bringing 100 kilograms of cocaine from Colombia via Amsterdam. Completely different. And we'd call them both organised crime, but the template and the activities and therefore the investigative plan is completely different.
Well, that's a good point, actually. Could you maybe give us an overview of just some examples of, you mentioned counterfeit clothing and drugs, but what other things could we think of that are considered organized crime?
Yeah, the key thing here is commodities. So anything that is a commodity can be, so if it's human trafficking, cybercrime, money laundering, fraud, and then you've got the whole range of drugs, and then you go into wildlife trafficking. So in terms of ivory, there's a huge market for, say, illegal cheetahs, or rhino horn, or like venomous snakes, or there is anything where there is a demand, like counterfeit medicines, for example, during COVID. Any commodity you can think of that people want to buy and sell, and there is an ability to do that while sort of bending the rules and going and doing it on even illegal waste management, for example, then organised crime can be involved in that. The scale of activities is incredible, which is why, again, it's so fascinating to study, because one week you could be looking at opium smugglers from Afghanistan, the next you could be examining how people are producing counterfeit whiskey in Azerbaijan.
We've got a question here. I'm not quite sure what to make of it. But I'll show you, Chris, just in case you know what he means. So this is Vince Wise. What due diligence do you personally carry out before carrying out work for a sponsor or employer?
So I think the key thing there is information is power at the end of the day. So what you'd have to make sure, like, I think what Vince is talking about there is, if you were organised crime is very similar to legitimate business, and a lot of them use fronts to actually set up these sorts of business. So you could, if you were a private consultant, for example, you have to be very careful that the people you're actually working for, and when if they've commissioned you to design, I don't know, a really efficient anti-money laundering plan, what they're not actually doing is they're actually going to use those holes and then turn it into a really efficient money laundering scheme. So yeah, you have to be very careful. A lot of the work that Criminalist does is generally done through recommendations. So if somebody knows that I've done something in the past, or if I've worked with somebody who has worked with somebody else, perhaps used to be in the university sector or used to be in that policing sector. So there's that sense of trust. LinkedIn is really useful for that, actually, because you can Google a name and you can work out, well, okay, they know this person, that person, and that person. If I give that person a call, I can say, right, what are they like? What are they doing now? Are they who they say they are? And I think that's a key thing when it comes to organised crime, because of the sophistication of some of these groups.
Okay, yeah, Vince, I hope that has answered your question. Any other questions, please just put them in the chat. Put a Q in front of it, so I know that it's a question for Chris. I've got a question for you, Chris. What has changed in organised crime over the past few years? How has it morphed, evolved, evolutionized? I don't know if there's a verb for evolution. Evolved, yeah. How has it evolved? I already said that.
I think there's one word really, Susanne, and it's cybercrime. Okay. As the world we've got more digital. I mean, that the process of digitalization and globalization started in the 70s, where suddenly, like, what happened was the advent of cheap air travel meant we could actually go to some of these places like New York and stuff in 5 or 6 hours. Suddenly, like, the internet's come on, and I could be doing this from a beach in Thailand and still have the same impact. I mean, I'm doing it from cold Oxfordshire, but like in terms of like how, some of the evolutions, like, and organised crime, it's made legitimate business more efficient, globalization and technology, but it's also made organised crime more efficient as well, because it's allowed, and COVID-19 is a perfect example. Suddenly there's been, as the NHS started to bring out all this preventative stuff in terms of COVID, so in terms of the people being pinged, in terms of them sending safety advice, in terms of them sending out details of when people need to book jabs, suddenly all these fake websites sprang up, all these fake text messages saying actually, if you go onto this website and put in your personal details, we'll tell you when you can get your jab. And what they've done there is suddenly organised crime are preying on people's fear of the pandemic and using it to take people's details, and then they can harvest those details. And in reality, like, as the world gets more digitized, organised crime is only going to get more efficient, because we're putting more and more of our personal data into the digital world.
Well, my next question is, and I don't know if you're going to tell me off or not, what is the most efficient way of dealing with organised crime?
I think there's no one way, because it depends. If you're dealing with a group of money launderers in the City of London, for example, or money launderers in Abu Dhabi, like, that will be a completely different approach to dealing with a street gang in Nottingham or a bunch of cannabis dealers in Morocco. Like, sometimes community intervention is really useful. Sometimes, like, for example, if you were to look at the Colombia, where if you can give the Colombian farmers or the Afghan opium producers something else that they can make as much money off with opium, and bearing in mind that generally opium and coca plant are pretty much the only sources of income in those places, you give them an alternative that can make them that amount of money, the same amount of money that they can live on without it being illegal, then a lot of them will move over. But if there isn't that alternative, then they're going to have to continue to take the illegal route. And it's the same thing in terms of in terms of policing as well. So like sometimes a investigation where you go in and arrest and knock doors down is the most efficient way of doing things. If there is an organised crime group that's causing trouble, then importing lots of cocaine, for example, and sometimes it's the most efficient way to do it is, right, okay, we're going to arrest these people, and therefore that sends a message that we're not going to tolerate this sort of thing in the community. I think there's that balance between the community measures and the policing measures, and it all depends on what sort of organised crime activity you're dealing with.
Do you have an example? I'm going to put you on the spot here now, Chris. Do you have an example of a very memorable investigation that you maybe worked on or heard of, something that you found really fascinating, or that for whatever reason really stuck with you, that you can share with us?
I think there's a really interesting one. So when I was developing the U-Battle framework for the PhD, I ended up doing a case based on, so you might have seen there was some newspaper coverage a couple of years back around lots of burglars from Chile coming over from Chile on 90-day visas, ransacking UK houses for 90 days and then going back on the same visas again. So I ended up working with the Met Police on doing some analysis for that, and also working through the contact at the Chilean embassy, also with the Chilean police as well. And it was really interesting in terms of the cooperation side of things, that how much the police knew, and a lot of the stuff that the police knew was actually based on open source. And that for me is really fascinating, that while yes, the police have their own databases and intelligence stuff, there's also a huge amount. Some of the stuff they were showing me that was part of their investigation was they were quoting something that was secondhand from an international newspaper. And the same thing in terms of intelligence gaps. When you go over to the Chilean side, what they didn't know was almost as important as what they did know as well. And I think that's really important in terms of, once analysing a situation is then important to then try and determine what the response is, because every situation is different.
Tell us a bit, so you mentioned U-Battle here. Tell us what that is. So that's a tool that you developed. What does it do and what is it used for?
U-Battle, it's an acronym. So anyone who has worked in policing knows policing absolutely adores an acronym. So something has to have an acronym, otherwise it doesn't get into policing. So it stands for Utilising Business Analysis Towards Targeted Law Enforcement. And it's essentially a series of questions based on adapted versions of techniques, so standard business analysis techniques, Porter's 5 Forces, McKinsey's 7 S's, and I've adapted them and applied them to intelligence data. And the idea being that we approach organised crime from a business perspective, therefore looking at the vulnerabilities of an organised crime group from a business perspective, and that then informs the development of an investigative strategy from the policing perspective and makes it more efficient when we try and dismantle them.
Okay, well, that seems to make sense, and well done for developing that. And that's something that we'll talk. That's something you teach in your course as well. That we'll get to in a minute. What do you think what do you think does the future look like for organized crime, if you can make any such predictions?
I think there's huge challenges in terms of policing organised crime, particularly when we look at the international cooperation. I think that's going to be the main issues in the future. I mean, you look at Brexit, whereas we've now essentially become a third country member of Europol. So we've lost a lot of the influence we had in terms of sharing information, in terms of collating analysis. And as a result of that, that weakens our international response, because criminals, like if you take cybercrime, for example, a criminal could be sat on a beach in Thailand, and they could be sending thousands and thousands of malware requests out and attacking various computers through a botnet. And that botnet could be based in another country, say in Israel, and that the servers for where they're getting it off the dark web could be based in Pakistan. And then you come back and actually some of the victims are in Italy, France, Germany. Say for the cyber criminal to jump through those hoops into different jurisdictions takes them a few seconds, because the advent of the internet, you can go to different websites in different jurisdictions with ease. From a policing perspective, if you're trying to follow that breadcrumb trail to go from Thailand to Israel to Pakistan to Italy, each of that time you then, once you go into trying to have an investigation that is on that country's sovereign territory, that becomes incredibly difficult. You have to write a letter of request. You have to make sure that you're to formally approach the relevant law enforcement authorities. That takes months. And if the cyber criminals have done that 7, 8, 9 times, the investigation is almost a non-starter. And I think there was a really interesting report by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, written by a couple of Canadian academics from, I think, a university in Vancouver. And they set out several scenarios of what organised crime cooperation would look like. Because currently the UN system, where everyone comes together, says this is what we need to do against organised crime. Some people then go back and implement it. Some people go back and ignore it. And because it's the UN and they don't have any real power, nothing really happens either way. So then you have regional blocks like Europol, which can be really effective, but then some people, because of political reasons, people like the UK, who generally have quite a stellar reputation in terms of investigating organised crime and intelligence, are leaving those regional blocks. And then you have countries like Russia, China, North Korea, who are essentially shunning the international community and saying, right, it doesn't matter what you guys do, we're doing what's best for us. And how that plays out in the global geopolitics over the next decade, I think it'll be fascinating for organised crime, whether the world tries to sticks with international cooperation, whether it devolves to regional, wherever everyone goes, these international structures aren't working. It's every man for himself, or whether we try and agree some brand new strategic vision, which will try and reach out to countries around the world and have an effective global way of combating organised crime. I think that will be fascinating to watch and to see how it unfolds in the future.
Well, that's a massive imbalance there, isn't it, in terms of power and opportunities? Like you say, somebody could be sitting on a beach and could be offending in a number of countries against a number of laws, and they can do that, just with typing on the keyboard. But then, like you say, for an investigator to follow that, they have to apply to other countries to get the data, to get permissions, and it's just a nightmare. And I think as long as that red tape exists, we're always going to be woefully behind, and we are usually woefully behind many criminals, aren't we? Because we can't adapt because of all these procedures. We need to apply for budgets, we need to apply for permission, we need to apply for this, and it can just take ages.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the processes, the rules, and the red tape that law enforcement has to follow is a huge inhibitor to try and counteract. You can understand why it was put in place in the first place, of course, but because organised crime doesn't have to follow that, they're so much more freer and flexible. It means policing is always on the back foot when trying to counteract this.
Yeah. So, but in terms of what we are able to do, you've actually put some of that knowledge together into a course that is now on the Police Science Doctor Academy. I'm just going to show you the image for that. Can you just tell us a little bit about this course? What do people get from that? So if analysts and investigators come onto that, what will they learn?
Yeah, so essentially it's a 2-module course, 8 weeks per module. Each week will have 3 hours coverage, and it'll be live online. So you get that real world interaction like you would do if you were face to face, but it's much easier for you to fit it in with your challenging policing job and the rest of your life as well. And it's also recorded. If for whatever reason you can't make 1 week, there will be a digital copy you can come and access as well. So I think the first module is looking at organised crime and how it's policed. So it looks at some of the international policing structures. So from a regional, local, national, and international perspective, it then moves on to look at some of the tactics, some of the investigative methods, and some of the case studies to use in organised crime. Also looks at analysing organised crime. So what we know about it at the minute, what we don't know. It looks also when we introduce the U-Battle framework for investigative strategy development. And then the second module is much more focused on the actual crimes that define organised crime. So we do sessions on drug smuggling, we do sessions on human trafficking, on cybercrime, money laundering, on outlaw biker gangs. I think there's a whole range of criminalities. We also look at wildlife trafficking, and essentially each session is so the first session is a lecture, so it's quite an interactive session where I sort of give an overview of the topic, and then we go through some of the key trends and some of the reasons behind that. And then the second half of the session is then a seminar where we discuss some of the key points, some of the challenges around that, and start to try and develop some ideas about actually how to counteract some of the threats we've sort of outlined in this session. And I think that's the key thing about this. Like, yeah, it's all about actually, learning about a really fascinating new area and then applying that knowledge back into a policing context to actually make a difference in the real world.
Yeah, and maybe as you've seen that from the poster that I overimposed over your face whilst you were explaining everything. So it's so the plan is to run weekly sessions from January. So that'll be module 1. That will last for 8 weeks, and then in April we start module 2. That will last 8 weeks, and you can either do both modules or you can only do one or the other. And you can also, if only certain sessions are relevant to you, you can also, just get single sessions and just wait for these to be delivered. And so it's really, really flexible. I mean, extremely flexible, because like you said, you can turn up live. Obviously, that would be the preference, because you can then interact and get involved in the discussion and everything. Or you can watch the recording afterwards. If based on your time zone you can't make it. What would you say are the unique features of this course? And when you compare it to other courses on organized crime, perhaps what is different about this one?
I think, although I'm going to stretch the definition of unique here, I think there are 3 unique features. Like, in terms of, so firstly, we've talked about flexibility. So yeah, this is the way of delivering it. We've got it online. We'll have it on a certain time each week, and we can have that live discussion. But if you can't make that, then it's recorded. So there is that balance there. We appreciate that policing it's a fascinating profession to be in, but sometimes things don't go to plan. And sometimes when you say to someone you meet at 5 o'clock, an operation comes up and you can't meet at 5 o'clock because because of other commitments, and we totally understand that. Secondly, the detail. Like, we can go in depth into the mechanics of drug smuggling, for example. You can take you through the precise criminal requirements that go from smuggling cocaine from 100 kilogram load from Bogota, and how it gets right across into UK, and then how from there it gets split up into different parcels and actually moves out and gets delivered into various towns and cities across the UK. That level of detail isn't available in many other courses. And I think the key thing, the third unique element, is the cost, because there are, so for example, master's degrees you can do in organised crime. The cost of those is sort of generally in the region of £7,000, £8,000, £9,000, because universities have lots of overheads. They have, the actual course costs money to be authorized, to be checked, and everything else like that. So as a result of that, these courses, because you get a certificate with a nice shiny little label on it that says you've got a master's degree, but then that costs you £9,000. We can have the same level of sort of detail, the level of academic rigor, the level of, and particularly make it a lot more relevant to practitioners, but we can do it for sort of a tenth of the price. The beauty of the fact that we can do it as a professional short course. You get you've done your qualification in organised crime, but because it doesn't have those two little the MA, for example, in there, and the certificate from the university, means we can actually make it much more affordable for the practitioner.
And you do get a certificate at the end as well. So after, if you're only doing one session, you'll get a certificate. If you're doing a module or 2 modules, you get a certificate as well from the academy that has my shiny logo and your shiny logo on it. So
yeah, exactly. You get that, and that also counts towards your CPD points as well if you're a police officer. So.
Okay, so we've got a question here from Sam. How many hours of lectures does the course cover in total?
So lectures we'd have, so each module, so there's 8 sessions in the module, and lectures are generally 2 hours of each 3 hours. So you'd have 16 hours, so 32 hours for the entire course in total, and then 16 hours on top of that of seminars and discussion.
Yeah, because what's also in there is that you've got some resources, things that people should and could read, obviously, to further deepen their knowledge. And then the other thing, I don't think you've mentioned that, is after each session, learners are actually required to summarize their understanding of what you just taught them and hand that into the academy, and then you will actually check that. So again, we're trying to make sure that people get a really good understanding of what you're teaching them, that they walk away with a good level of knowledge, because, we all know what it's like when you passively listen to something. And, even if you get involved in the discussion afterwards, if you then have to sit down and go through everything that you've just listened to and understood, and you have to write it out, that, that just gets your brain juices flowing again. So that's another requirement, and, to make sure that we get a good understanding there.
That active element is a key, because, I've been on courses when I was with City of London Police where it's impossible to actually fail them, because what happens, you get sent on a 3-day course and then you finish with an exercise and they go, oh great, everyone's passed. Like, you have to have that element of to show an understanding, like to say, right, this is what we've learned, this is how it applies. Otherwise there's no value in attending a course. You need to have actually to have learned something and to have proved you've learned something as well.
Yeah, and actually, in terms of learning theory, it's much better to do bits of learning over time, repeated over time, rather than, going like you said, on a 3-day course, because you only walk away with about 10% of, you only remember about 10% of what you learn in classroom-based training. And, if 10% of your 3 days is not that much, but if you're doing something weekly and then, you're going over it, and then you have to type something up and submit it, and then you do the next one, you get a much better learning experience that way as well. Okay, so so if you've got the link to the website there, if you go to www.academy.policysciencedoctor.com, you will see all the course options there. So it's either 2 full modules or one of any one of the modules, or you can just pick and choose which session is most relevant to you. If you don't want to, for example, if your employer is not paying for it and you just want to work on your own professional development, you can definitely afford the single sessions there. So Chris, if you had a magic wand and you could make one change in policing, what would that be?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is to give them a proper research budget to engage in academia. So that actually, I think there's so much work that, having been in the police and now in academia as a lecturer and a lecturer and a researcher, I think that's what's really key is there's so much knowledge in academia and so much willingness in academia to go and find out what these intelligence gaps are, for example, in money laundering and drug trafficking. But the police and police want to engage, and there's a lot of really good people in policing who would bite your left arm off to have a team of academics delve into their data and work out some of the nuts and bolts of what they know and what they don't know about a certain element of organised crime and how they could improve it. But as we all know, that there just isn't the resource for some of these large-scale projects. And if we could change that, I think policing in the UK would be in a much better place, because we would be able to really bring that academic rigor in. And from that, the benefits of that would just fall out.
And if people only took away one thing from this interview, what would you want that one thing to be? That, what would you want the 10% that they retain from this interview to be?
Well, aside from the fact that I'm running the course in January and that they should all sign up, I think that'd be the first thing. But probably that once you start to understand organised crime and how it operates, the problems around policing it don't seem quite so intractable as they did. And I think that's the key bit. We can give you the knowledge base to start to try and solve the problems that you see in your everyday working life.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'll leave you guys with that. So Chris, Alan, thank you very much for your time today, and we'll hope to see some or many of you on the course. So do have a look, www.academy.policysciencedr.com, and if you've got any questions, just send us an email, and we'll hope to see you there. So have a good night, everyone. Bye bye. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Susanne. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for watching. I hope you found this content useful. You can get access to each episode's transcript with key learning points, timestamps, and references if you get yourself onto my mailing list. Just go to the main website on policesciencedoctor.com, and on the bottom of each page you will find a sign-up form for notifications of new content. Just enter your first name, your preferred email address, and the type of organization you work for. You will not get any spam. This is just for me to let you know about new content and for you to get access to all the transcripts.